like to welcome our generous donors from the Colonnade Society. Now, my college houses the Department of Government and Politics, and it's natural, therefore, for us to host Constitution Day events, which we do on a regular basis every year. Our moderator is a Government and Politics alumnus, Representative Dennis Cardoza, and our three outstanding faculty panellists are Drs. Paul Herndson, Stella Rouse, and Antoine Banks, and we're also joined by the new Chair of Government and Politics, Dr. Owen Morris. Can I just ask those to stand up and be recognised? Thanks also to Dr. Philip Resnick and React Labs. This year we're stepping up our act by having an interactive portion of our programme tonight for those of you with smartphones and who are smart enough to actually be able to use them. You will be getting guidance on this later on in the introduction. As general election nears, government and politics gets extra attention, especially in its Centre for American Politics and Citizenship, headed by Professor Paul Herndson. During election season, we often turn on the television, open a newspaper to see mayor and faculty and students engaged in key political conversations, from the economy and jobs, to global diplomacy and terrorism, to sustainability and environmental degradation. In BSOS, we work to be the solution to the world's great challenges. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome as our MC, former Congressman Dennis Cardoza, who recently was named Managing Director for Government Affairs and Public Policy at Marriott, Phelps & Phillips. In addition to being an alumnus of the University of Maryland with a BA in Government and Politics in 1982, Dennis is a member of our BSOS's Board of Visitors. Dennis has long been a friend of our college and our university, and we're honoured to have you with us tonight. Thank you. Dennis is joined by other members of our Board of Visitors and our Alumni Chapter Board, and I want especially to welcome these distinguished guests whose dedication and engagement means so much to our college and our university. I'd like to take just a couple of moments to thank all the people, in addition to Dennis and others who've made this event possible. First, I'd like to recognise the university's Colonnade Society. This society represents our leadership donors who give a minimum of $1,000 to the university every year in support of our programmes and initiatives. There are more than 100 members of the society in the audience tonight, and we thank you for your generosity and indeed encourage all of our alumni and friends to consider joining at this level and becoming members of the Colonnade Society. I'd also like to thank the Office of the Provost for their support of this programme and recognise the important work of staff members from the Staff Student Union, the Colonnade Society and BSOS for all their hard work in making this evening a great success. Finally, thank you all for being here and participating. We hope you are entertained, but also the responsibility on you to be entertaining by asking really smart questions when your chance comes. So we really want you to participate. And we hope we have a really very enjoyable evening. So let us begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our alumnus and friend, Congressman Dennis Cardoza. Dennis.
Thank you, Dean Townsend, and all of you for that warm welcome. It's wonderful to be here tonight to celebrate Constitution Day across America and to discuss some interesting topics with our faculty members from the Department of Government and Politics. It's a wonderful document, our Constitution, and the document that we celebrate tonight. It defines us as a nation, and it outlines our rights as citizens. It protects us from a government that could have ever-broadening scope. Unfortunately, it didn't protect me from the meter maids tonight. Those folks at the University of Maryland who are just fabulously efficient in their ability to prosecute, but since I was guilty, I will take my rapping. In addition to being an alumnus and a member of the Board of Visitors of the College of Behavior and Social Sciences, as John mentioned, I also want to mention that I'm a proud Terp parent. And as proud Terp parents will know, my daughter was going to be here tonight, but she forgot. And so I think she's busy running from the dorm now across campus, and hopefully will be here just in time to catch dinner after the presentation. I've been thinking about our Constitution Day, which was established as a federal observance in 2004 to recognize the adoption of the Constitution and to celebrate the rights and privileges we have as U.S. citizens. I was pleased, while I was a member of Congress in 2004, to have voted for this bill. Before 2004, it was called Citizenship Day. It usually was celebrated on September 17th, as it was that day in 1787 when the United States Constitutional Convention signed the document. But we, like we always like to do, be unique here at Maryland, we're celebrating tonight on the 19th. There is one more fact about this day of observance that I wanted to share with you. All U.S. colleges and universities that receive federal funding, as ours does, is legally required by that bill that I was telling you about to observe Constitution Day and to have a special presentation. This is our fulfillment of that federal mandate. So you see, it's not just students who have to contend with a lot of requirements that are put on and mandates and rules here on campus. The administration gets its fair share of mandates as well. But of course, we're not just celebrating tonight because we have to. We are celebrating tonight because the Constitution remains, in many ways, is the very heart of law, policy, politics, citizenship, and our community engagement in the United States. It has an impact on the lives of all American citizens, from birth to the date one takes, or the date one takes the oath of citizenship through one's death. It affects anyone who visits or makes a new home in this country. It affects the way all Americans participate as members of the global community. And our Constitution has been studied and debated and challenged not only by our own politicians and leaders and scholars, but by politicians and leaders and scholars around the world as they establish or review their own constitutional governments. And so the importance, the scope, and the impact of this document cannot be overstated. Another reason we are here at Maryland, why we here at Maryland take such pride in celebrating Constitution Day, is that this university is committed not only to educating students, but also to encouraging the development of engaged, curious, involved citizens. Without an educated and engaged public, there cannot be a healthy democracy. Students, in addition to focusing on your studies and your future careers, now is a wonderful time for you to start getting involved on campus, in your communities, in your states, and in your nation. I was speaking earlier tonight to one of the student reporters who is a freshman here in the audience tonight. She said she was going to get involved in student government, and she's already in her third week of school. She's a reporter for the Diamondback. I got to tell you, that's the kind of spirit that we love to see here at Maryland. Students here are not just studying about your classes, you're studying for your own individual futures. Be informed about the issues that are important to you and to our communities. Get involved, as I was just talking about, and take the initiative to bring about change. We will be doing some voting tonight, and I urge you to register and vote and to exercise your right to vote in November. Now, back to what we are all here to talk about tonight, the Constitution. While it has been amended and has remained a part of active dialogue and policymaking over the years, we must remember that our Constitution was originally drafted and signed in 1787. While this was a proud and defining moment of U.S. history, it was also a problematic time in our history. This was a time when slavery was practiced in the United States. This was a time when women couldn't participate or vote. This was a time when the issues and the technology, the innovation and the conversations and the challenges that face our nation today could not have been anticipated. And even though our Constitution is a strong foundation for our laws, it is a strong backbone for our country, it has had to be a living document. It has had to adapt and it has had to change. And tonight we celebrate this spirit of examination, of reason and an education, and of change. We celebrate both the history and the future of the Constitution and our country. And finally, as someone who has spent a great deal of time in California and in Washington in service to my country, I must tell you that it is my pleasure to be here tonight and celebrate our Constitution Day, because it is a day, as you can see, brings us together. In just a few weeks, we will hold a presidential election. And during the election season, there's going to be an awful lot of rhetoric. You've already started to hear some of it. The debates and just the plain noise that can make us want to disengage and leave the problems and fighting to someone else and leave the decisions to someone else. But every citizen, regardless of your political affiliation or opinion, is called on to come together on Constitution Day to celebrate our great nation and the great document. So let's do that tonight. And let's bring that spirit of learning that we have in this wonderful university of ours, of pride and engagement with us as we go back into our communities, into the discussions with our neighbors, both our friends and our opponents, and into that voting booth in November. Tonight, I have a great honor of introducing a friend that we will hear, several friends, and we'll hear from 3 members of our Department of Government and Politics who will be discussing some truly timely events. During our third and final presentation, you as an audience will have the ability to weigh in on these topics by casting votes using your smartphones. So please have your smartphones happy, but please have them silenced in the meantime. We begin with our faculty presentations, and I started to introduce him before I had given my previous admonition, Paul Harrington. Paul is director of University of Maryland's Center for American Politics and Citizenship, CAPCI, and is a professor of the Department of Government and Politics. He was named a distinguished scholar teacher at the University of Maryland. He's also the principal investigator of the Maryland State Board of Elections, which funded a project to run the Maryland Election Center and to research Maryland's campaign finance and voting, and to provide and analyze a mechanism for delivering absentee ballots via the internet. Dr. Harrington has directed the National Science Foundation and Carnegie Corporate Project to study voting technology and ballot design. You weren't in charge of those ballots with the Chads a few years ago, were you? Also, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission project to recruit, train, and retain election judges, and the Campaign Assessment and Candidate Outreach Project, which is funded by the Pew Charitable Trust. His current interests include Congress, political parties and elections, money in politics, and voting technology, and as I said, ballot design. Please join me in welcoming one of the true scholars of the university and a true friend of the Government and Politics Department, Professor Paul Harrington.
Okay, my PowerPoint is up. I think I'm good to go. Well, Dennis, thank you for that kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and the Colonnade Society for inviting me to participate in this event. I'd especially want to thank all of you for coming, braving the traffic and everything else. Well, I plan to open with a question. Do you plan to invest $3 million or more in the upcoming election? If so, please raise your hand. Well, I don't see too many people. I'm not surprised, but I think our development officers may be a little disappointed. Well, let me introduce you to some people who have spent at least that much and will spend more. First, meet the Adelsons, Miriam and Sheldon. They own the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, and they've spent about $37 million in the election, a nice investment. Now meet the Simmonses, Harold and Annette. They live in Dallas and own Contran Corporation, and they've spent about $16 million in this election. And now meet Bob Perry, a home builder from Houston, who's invested $15 million, and also meet their friends. Well, most of these people have given contributions to candidates and political parties, but these are relatively small contributions. Instead, most of them have given their millions to interest groups, including some that were formed only this year or maybe a few years ago, and some that will probably disappear after this election. Now, the roles of interest groups in federal elections are interesting. If you look at their campaign contributions, they typically account for 1/3 of the contributions raised by House candidates, 13% of the contributions raised by Senate candidates, and a tiny fraction of the contributions raised by presidential candidates. So what's the fuss? Well, the fuss is related to outside spending. Interest groups now are spending record sums of money on TV and other forms of advertising intended to influence the election. It's pretty new. How can this be? Well, let me take a few minutes to talk about the unraveling of the federal campaign finance system, and you'll see how. The current system was introduced by the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974, amended by the Bipartisan Campaign Act of 2002, and several other reforms. It was influenced by regulatory decisions of the Federal Election Commission and greatly weakened by a string of Supreme Court rulings that includes the Citizens United case. This slide gives a picture of the impact of regulatory changes on the roles of interest groups in elections. And you can see we've gone from needing 3 letters, PAC for Political Action Committee, to a veritable alphabet soup to describe interest groups that participate in elections. So what's a PAC? A traditional PAC is a fund set up by a corporation, union, trade association, or some other group that collects limited sums of money from individuals, only from living, breathing individuals. It uses that money to make limited contributions to political parties and especially candidates. Some PACs also use their funds to make independent expenditures. These are expenditures that are made without the knowledge or consent of a candidate or anybody influencing their campaign organization or working with that organization. Very important, political action committees disclose all their transactions, who gives and where they spend their money. Next, we come to the super PACs. No, not the slide, sorry. Down on the list with the pointer. Now, super PACs can raise unlimited amounts of money from any source, not just individuals. And they can spend that money pretty much however they like, with some exceptions. They cannot directly contribute to candidates or parties. Super PACs, like traditional PACs, also must disclose those people who have given them donations and where they've spent their money. The other groups towards the bottom of the slide, the 527 committees and the 501Cs, which are referred to as social welfare organizations, and by the way, these names come from their placement in the Internal Revenue Code, can do things very similar to super PACs, but they face limited or no public disclosure requirements. Get the money from anywhere if you're a 501c, spend it however you want, but you don't have to well, you have to report to the IRS who gave you your money, but the IRS does not publicly release it. Of course, you can tell the super PAC, the 501c can tell candidates that it's supported where the money came from. So let me give you some names of some organizations that fall into this new scheme. There's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, sounds familiar, aligned with business. There's American Crossroads and Crossroads GPS, the brainchild of Karl Rove, which is aligned with the Republican Party. There's Restore Our Future, aligned with Mitt Romney, and Priorities USA Action, which is associated with President Obama and his campaign and the Democrats, and finally, numerous unions, obviously associated with Democrats. Now, changes in the law and the rise of spending by these new groups are important. They influence who runs for office, who can wage a viable campaign, and whose voices have the greatest impact on how we vote and who wins. Let me give you some quick figures. In the 2006 midterm elections, traditional PACs accounted for 92% of all interest group spending. In 2010, they accounted for 33%. In 2012, they could account for even more. Slide 4, please. This slide shows the shape of interest group spending in 2010, the first election influenced by the Citizens United ruling. And you can see that traditional PACs, which are in purple, made $403 million in contributions, roughly 58% of all interest group spending. They also made about $53 million in independent expenditures, another 9%. The total comes to 2/3 of interest group spending. The rest of the spending, which are the green, purple, and bright blue slices of the chart, accounts for about 1/3. So these organizations were unleashed in the middle of the 2010 cycle, 2009, and by the end of that cycle, they accounted for 1/3 of all spending. You can see that that spending includes independent expenditures and electioneering communications, which are similar, by super PACs, 501Cs, 527s, and the corporations, unions, trade associations, and other groups that sponsor these new interest group entities. These groups, again, unleashed by the Citizens United case and other rulings, are important. Most of their spending appears on TV ads, and very often voters can't focus or can't tell the difference between these ads and candidate ads. Slide 5. So what does independent spending by super PACs, 501Cs, and these other new groups do to elections? Well, it makes them much more negative. If you take a look at the first column, that's for traditional PAC independent expenditures. And you can see that 2/3 of these independent expenditures are positive and only 1/3 are negative. Take a look at the second column, and you see what the new groups are doing in terms of their independent expenditures. 80% are negative. Take a look at the third column. This represents electioneering communications by these new groups. These kinds of communications can attack a candidate or make a contrast between a candidate and the opponent that slams one candidate. They're almost never positive. They're really pretty ugly. So how does this outside spending affect elections? Well, most of it takes place in close races where spending matters, and it can be important. Here's some facts. In 2010, there were 9 House races where interest group spending, the total spending, was greater than the spending by both of the candidates combined. In that same year, there were 100 interest groups, in 100 races, interest groups spending exceeded the spending of one candidate. In 40 of these races, interest groups spent more money attacking one candidate than that candidate's total spending. Well, what does this mean for the candidate? A, you're thrown off message. B, you don't have any money to respond to these allegations. And C, you're probably unable to cut through the din, all this noise, to defend your record or present your issue positions. For voters in these races, they don't get balanced information. They don't get the information they need to make an informed vote choice. Now, the 2012 elections promise to be the most expensive ever. We expect more than $6 billion to be spent. I would guesstimate that 10% of this spending will be done by the new interest group entities I talked about. Most of it will be concentrated in the presidential race or in the 70 to 90 House and Senate races that are going to be fairly close. Most of it will be negative, and much of it will be from undisclosed sources. The presidential election provides an example of the potential impact of interest group spending. And here I'm going to refer to some figures that were available at the time of the Republican convention. At this time, the Obama campaign had spent $263 million, and the Romney campaign had spent $163 million from monies that they collected from individuals of limited amounts. The president obviously had a huge fundraising lead. When you put outside spending into the equation, monies meant to influence the race between these two candidates, you add an additional $124 million. Now, 71% of that money was intended to hurt Obama and therefore help Romney, and that's about $87 million. It considerably narrows the spending gap. I think this makes the point that interest group spending, some of it from secret sources, will go a long way in shaping what we see and hear about the election. So I opened with a question, so I ought to close with a question. Will everyone who thinks the campaign finance system needs major change or should be replaced, please raise your hand? Well, there are a lot of hands up there. Well, guess what? The mass The vast majority of you answer yes, and about 80% of all Americans agree. In fact, roughly 75% of people who make contributions to political campaigns agree, and even most candidates agree. Well, guess who doesn't agree? I'm pretty sure the Adelsons, the Simmonses, the Rob Perry, and others who contribute millions of dollars to these new interest group organizations that were recently unleashed to participate in our elections think otherwise. They don't agree. So I'll add my voice to the voices of those who believe that the role of interest groups in politics, especially the role of undisclosed money spent in elections, is cause for concern. If you want to learn more, here's a place to start. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was very good. And to underscore your message, after 5 terms in Congress, I decided not to run for re-election this year and seek office for exactly the kinds of reasons you talked about. Our next presenter is Stella Rouse, an assistant professor in the Department of Government and Politics and a research fellow at the University of Maryland Center for American Politics and Citizenship. Her research and teaching interests focus on Latino politics, minority politics, legislative and political behavior, and network analysis. She has published articles on group dynamics and co-sponsorship, religion and public opinion, and Latino representation in education. She has a forthcoming book titled Latinos and the Legislative Process, Interests and Influence. Professor Rouse's research has been funded by the Ford Foundation and by the National Science Foundation. Tonight, she will be discussing voter ID laws. Professor, welcome, and thank you for being a presenter tonight.
Thank you, Dennis, for that warm welcome. And thank you, everyone, for coming. This evening, I'm going to talk about an issue that's been very salient in the election cycle, and hopefully one that everyone is somewhat familiar with. The issue of strict voter ID laws and whether the strict voter ID laws translate into voter suppression. So over the past several years, a number of states have enacted strict voter ID laws. And this has led to accusations that these laws will lead to voter suppression. So there's been a recent upswelling. There's been a recent upswelling of voter ID laws. And what do we mean by voter ID laws? Well, voter ID laws are laws that require some form of government identification in order to be able to vote. And what we mean by government identification is either photo or non-photo ID when you go to the polls to vote. And 32 states have some form of voter ID laws with varying degrees of strictness. Since Republicans won control of state governments in the 2010 midterm elections, at least 11 states have pushed through voter ID laws. And these voter ID laws have been tied to the American Legislative Council, Exchange Council, which is an organization that's based in Washington. The enactment of voter ID laws, 62 photo ID laws in 37 states in 2011 and 2012, largely sponsored by ALEC, a DC tax-exempt organization that has about 2,000 state legislative members that receive money from corporations, many corporations around the country. The group is supposed to actually develop bills that promote small government. But instead, ALEC, over the last couple of years, have actually dedicated their efforts to pushing through these strict state ID laws around the country. Critics of the voter ID laws claim that ALEC is pushing these bills through because to keep poor Americans who do not have IDs, who are likely to vote, for interest against conservative interests, which is what ALEC stands for. So I want to talk a little bit about the varying differences or degrees in the requirements for voting across the states because you all may not be familiar with them, okay? So when we talk about strict photo ID laws, we're talking about the fact that voters must show photo ID at polling places, government-issued photo ID. And they don't have photo IDs when they go to vote. They actually can, in many states, they can cast a provisional ballot. And that provisional ballot is held, and then the voter must follow it. It's upon the voter, it's incumbent upon the voter to then come back, right? Follow up with their polling place or district and come back and provide photo ID. So the responsibility is upon the voter, right, to come back and provide photo ID. We also have states that require photo ID or an alternative form of photo ID that's not government issued. So it could be a different form of identification that has a picture, or an alternative form of identification, or it could be where somebody vouches for them that has a photo ID. So it's less restrictive than the strict photo ID laws. Other states, you can provide a non-photo ID form of identification. For example, an electric bill, or something that proves that you are who you say you are. And then there's other states around the country that do not require photo ID at all for voting purposes. So there's a lot of variance around the country as far as what kind of identification or non-identification there is for voting purposes. Okay, so a lot of variance around the country. So of course, as one might expect, the parties have different positions on the issue of voter IDs. Republicans, of course, support stricter voter ID laws. And they believe that stricter voter ID laws are necessary in order to help prevent voter fraud. They also believe that it ensures the integrity of the elections and the democratic process. On the other side of this issue are the Democrats, who believe that stricter voter ID laws are an undue burden for those trying to exercise their fundamental rights to vote. They believe that laws target minorities and groups that typically favor or are part of the Democratic base. And these include Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and college students, who are less likely to actually have photo IDs. Okay? And this leads to this slide right here that poses the question, why do some believe minorities may be suppressed with strict photo ID laws? And these numbers show who are the ones who are least likely to actually have photo IDs. Well, as we see in the numbers, Blacks, Asians, Latinos, and the young, right, the young adults, are the ones who are least likely to actually have a valid form of government-issued photo identification. So the states in red in this map show the states who have recently enacted some form of strict voter identification laws to some degree or other. Either strict voter IDs where in-person identification is required, other provisions of actually restricting canvassing or other things like that would not just be in-person voter identification, but trying to restrict efforts to get out the vote. And these are the 37 states that I spoke about earlier. I want to focus on 3 states in particular for a moment. And these are states that have been in the news, and some of you may have heard about them. Florida, Texas, and Pennsylvania. And the reason I'm focusing on these states is because they're states that the strict voter ID law, the laws have been challenged in the courts recently. Florida, for example, passed a law making voter registration drives harder to organize, on top of the fact that the strict voter ID was put into place. That law was struck down a few months ago because of the burden that it placed on minorities and the poor. And one of the senators that was responsible for passing the law made a statement that said, "I want people in Florida to want to vote as bad as the person in Africa who walks 200 miles across the desert." The next state, Texas, has arguably the most restrictive voter ID law in the country. A 3-judge federal panel ruled that Texas voter ID law was the most restrictive law in the country. The law requires voters to identify themselves with one of 5 forms of ID, including a driver's license or U.S. passport. Those lacking one of those 5 types of identification must obtain an election identification certificate. And it's a government ID similar to a driver's license. The problem for this is that there's only certain locations in Texas where this identification certificate can be located. And many people in Texas have to travel many miles to obtain this identification certificate. In the ruling, judges unanimously found that these fees and costs to travel to obtain the certificate was disproportionately affected the poor and minorities. Governor Perry criticized the three-judge panel who overturned the voter ID law in Texas, saying, "Chalk up another victory for fraud." In Pennsylvania, again, the law was criticized for being an obvious and admitted partisan reason for passing strict voter ID law. The court initially upheld the decision when it was in district court, but just yesterday, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the decision. There was criticism of partisan play when the voter ID law was passed, and I want to show you a little clip as to why there may have been reason for partisan play in the voter ID law in Pennsylvania.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
I don't know. It may have been partisan. I don't know. That may still be up for debate. Okay, so what about Maryland? We may ask. We are in Maryland. Maryland has no voter ID requirement. You may say, but why? I go to my polling place at Maryland and I show my identification to vote. And the pollster takes my identification and looks on the rolls and, I vote. But if you had no identification when you go to vote, you are allowed to cast a ballot. You do not need your identification to vote in Maryland. Maryland is a no identification state, okay? But as recently as this legislative session, laws were introduced into the Maryland legislature attempting to establish voter ID in Maryland. Those laws failed, okay? I'm not going to go through each one of them, but you can read real quickly. Attempts were made in the Maryland legislature to pass fairly strict, what I would say, voter ID laws, but no real support for those laws. They failed pretty quickly in the legislature. But Maryland is a no ID law state. Okay. So what about the argument between voter ID and voter suppression? Where is this? Are there really, does it have any legs, right? In terms of whether real voter ID and voter suppression exists. There's been 26 convictions of voter fraud by the federal government between 2002 and 2005. One study found that 10 cases of in-person voter fraud since 2000. Really, that amounts to one case for every 15 million eligible voters. There's no consensus on what effects strict voter ID laws have on voting. Okay? Some studies show that laws can depress turnout, but it's really too early to tell by what amount. Okay? Decrease in voting might correspond into a net swing in voting for Republicans by maybe 1% to 2%, but again, that's really too early to tell if that's really the case from the increase in the voter ID laws and what effect it's going to have on this election. And any study that's been done that has shown some of these numbers that have been shown in the cases that have been adjudicated have been contested. So there's really no consensus on what the effects are, either for voter ID, stricter voter ID laws, or the voter suppression. So what about public perception? Okay. 48% of Americans have heard some about the new voter ID laws that have been pushed through over the last couple of years. Surprisingly, about 3/4 of Americans believe voters should be required to show official government-issued voter identification to vote, and that's regardless of partisan affiliation. Okay. So, majority of Americans really do believe that people should have to show some form of identification. 48% of Americans believe voter fraud is a major problem, and about 41% of Americans believe voter suppression is a major problem. Okay? But really, these surveys or these polls that are done that ask these questions, a lot of it has to do with question wording, right? So if someone asks, well, do you believe there's voter fraud, right? And the context of these questions really have a lot to do with it. Or do you want to prevent voter fraud? Of course, people are going to answer, yeah, I want to prevent voter fraud. So, a lot of these surveys probably you have to take with a little bit of grain of salt. Opinions are pretty evenly distributed among all segments of the population, as we talked about. And pushing for laws to prevent voter fraud or pushing for laws to sort of do away with voter suppression both arguments fit into sort of the public's perception. So the question is, which one's better for business? For the Republican side of it or the Democratic side of it? So they're both fighting sort of the PR war when it comes to voter ID or voter suppression. So with that, I want to leave you with a little clip from Representative John Lewis. Okay. Representative John Lewis is a representative from Georgia who has served in Congress since 1987. He was a leader in the civil rights movement, playing a key role in the struggle to end segregation. Lewis has drawn a parallel to the efforts of suppressing votes currently to the fight for civil rights, for the civil rights movement, to those that are being pushed today, to try to suppress the votes. And as you will hear in his speech at the DNC, he champions greatly the fight, the fight that the Republicans are putting forward to suppress votes. And hopefully that sparks some debate and some questions during the Q&A. And I thank you for your time.
My dear friends, your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful non-violent tool we have to create a more perfect union. Not too long ago, people stood in unmovable lines. They had to pass a so-called literacy test, pay a poll tax. On one occasion, a man was asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. On another occasion, one was asked to count the jelly beans in a jar, all to keep them from casting their ballot. Today, it is unbelievable that there are Republican officials are trying to stop some people from voting. They are changing the rules, cutting polling hours and imposing a requirement intended to suppress the vote. The Republican leader in the Pennsylvania House even bragged that his state's new voter ID law is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state. That's not right, that's not fair, and that is not just. And similar efforts have been made in Texas, Ohio, Florida, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, and South Carolina. I've seen this before. I lived this before. Too many people struggled, suffered, and died to make it possible for every American to exercise their right to vote. And we have come too far together to ever turn back. So Democrats, we must not be silent. We must stand up, and speak out.
Well, thank you, Professor Rouse. That was a very good presentation. I, being one that won my first election to the State Assembly in California by 84 votes, can tell you that every vote counts. And I also had the opportunity to travel to Alabama and do an annual march that John Lewis does. Well, it's not annual, it's biannual. And while I was there, I got to see that jar of jelly beans still on the election counter in Birmingham, Alabama. I think it was in Birmingham. And so that was actually the case. Before you could register to vote, you had to guess how many jelly beans were in the jar. So you've got different kinds of things that have happened throughout our history you have to have a system that guarantees that the right people are doing what they're saying, because there's also been some situations in a place called Chicago where we all have that experience as well. So there's a dynamic tension. Thank you for a wonderful presentation there, and I really know everyone appreciated it here tonight. And now there are two people I would like to introduce. Professor Philip Resnick, who will give you an overview of the voting technology that he had developed that you will have a chance to utilize tonight, and Professor Antoine Banks from our Department of Government and Politics, who will discuss political imaging. Mr. Resnick is a professor with joint appointments in the Department of Linguistics and the Institute for Advanced Computer Studies. His research involves using technology and computational modeling to answer questions about language and social sciences. Last year, while he was on sabbatical, he found himself developing some new technology as part of the emerging field of computational political science. And we thought you'd find it interesting to see it as part of the presentations today. Antoine Banks, in addition to serving as an assistant professor in the Department of Government and Politics, is a research fellow at UMD's Center for American Politics and Citizenship, and is the director of the Political Science Research Lab. His research interests include racial and ethnic politics, emotions, political psychology, and public opinion. Specifically, his work focuses on the link between emotions and racial attitudes and the consequences it has for political preference. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Philip Resnick.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, long-haired computer scientist amongst the government and politics folks. This is just a brief introduction. I'll start with an assertion, and that is that traditional methods for gaining insight into public opinion are no longer working very well. So the traditional methods assumed something like this at dinner time, and a landline telephone that you would use to interrupt these folks and ask them questions. For a lot of people, dinner time now looks a little bit more like this. This is how people are spending their evenings, and they're not interested in answering the phone, particularly while they're eating, and they're using devices that are not the typical devices that the pollsters are using. And in fact, the polling organizations are really wrestling with what to do about this in terms of, people don't have landline phones, how do you reach people on cell phones and so forth. So there's a real problem here to be solved in tapping into what people actually care about, what issues matter, how they feel about them. So there are three trends that are happening simultaneously that are motivating the work that I'm going to show you briefly here. One is that people are using mobile devices a lot. A second that's quite interesting is that television is evolving into a two-way medium. You see the little Twitter hashtags in TV commercials. You see television shows where they're asking you to text message in or to tweet stuff in order to vote on things. It's becoming an interactive medium rather than something that goes one way. And a third trend is that people use social media and these devices, mobile devices, to express themselves and make themselves feel heard. So the people who are saying, don't call me on my telephone, are using their phones all the time to talk about what they care about. Is there a way to take advantage of this? This is not the way to take advantage of that. So what I did was to develop something that might be. There's some technology that I developed as a research project while on my sabbatical last year that was originally designed as a way simply to gather data to do linguistic research. I was interested in, and am interested in, framing and spin. How is language used to manipulate people's perceptions? And so I was interested in, when do people think a candidate is spinning, as opposed to answering the question in a straightforward way? This took on a life of its own and became something that, with the Maryland Technology Enterprise Institute, with their help, I'm in the process of commercializing. Hopefully, if all goes well, this will be something that will be in use and visible during the October presidential debates. We're going to try this stuff out. I was going to show you this picture, but I want to show you a slightly different picture, if somebody over there can bring it up. So I noticed before when people were coming in that there was somebody I'm assuming was a student, who was sitting here going like this on her phone. And I glanced over. At first I thought she was texting, and what it turned out was she was doing what a student does when she gets her hands on a new app that has a bunch of buttons and isn't quite sure what they do. So this is 30 seconds of this student just trying out the buttons on this app. And actually, if you'll zoom out 2 clicks, what you'll see here, she was using the apps, the buttons, which you'll see in a second, and I'm happy to say that the thing that came out on top, the button she hit most during that 30 seconds was, in fact, enthusiasm. We'll actually see what happens, if we go back to the slides, we'll see what happens when we actually try this out in a second. So what we're going to do is the following. Professor Banks, in a second, is going to give a talk that's about political ads. And there will come a point in that talk where he will invite you to watch an ad, actually there will be 2 of these, while simultaneously reacting to these on your smartphone using the app that I developed. For a debate, it might be configured as agree, disagree, spin, dodge. For this, we've actually put emotions on the button. Enthusiasm, anger, and so forth. So the way that you do this, I would invite you to do this now, is on your phone, on a smartphone, in your browser, if you haven't already done this, go to the URL umd.reactlabs, all one word, .org. And what you're going to see there is it'll bring you through the usual, please agree to these terms of service and so forth. Don't worry, there's nothing there you need to worry about. The IRB has already looked it over. Then you will basically be brought to a screen that looks like this, with hopeful, afraid, enthusiastic, angry. When the time comes during Professor Banks' talk, you'll be asked to react to these ads that he's showing. If you feel it, tap it. You don't have to wait till the end. You can do it more than once. As you feel it, tap the button. And this being a technology, I can tell you the technology works, but you can never tell what's going to happen in a room with 200 people in it. So we'll see what happens when we go ahead and try the app. The technical term for what might happen is glitches, but we'll find out. So with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Banks.
Thanks, sir. Can everyone hear me? Oh, I'll actually put it up during my talk, so you'll get to see it again. So can everyone hear me? So because this is the interactive part of the talk, I figured I'll walk around and be more interactive. So hi, everyone. How's everyone doing? So the purpose of this talk is to talk to you guys about the exciting and fascinating research on emotion in politics. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about how emotions from campaign ads influences people's political opinions and behaviors. Now, there's a substantial amount of research showing that campaign ads can have a powerful effect on voters. And one way is by altering the information people use to evaluate candidates. So say, for instance, you just saw a campaign ad that focuses on the economy. What studies have shown is that people are more likely to use this information about the economy when making their candidate decisions. And this process is known as what is called priming. That is, certain ads can make certain information more accessible in people's mind. And because that information is more accessible, people are more likely to use that when forming an opinion. So take, for example, Professor Rouse's presentation. If you saw an ad about voter fraud, people are more likely to use voter fraud or that information dealing with voter fraud and making a decision about the 2012 presidential election. Now, a lot of research has also looked at the effects of negative ads or attack ads. And what a lot of research has shown is that it can actually demobilize voters, essentially turning them off from politics. But I should note, however, that the evidence is mixed. There is more recent, well, not more recent, but there's other work that shows that the negativity in ads can actually boost participation or make people come out and vote. Now, besides looking at the valence of the ads, we know very little about discrete emotions or specific emotions that are aroused from these ads. For example, the emotions of anger, fear, disgust, sadness, enthusiasm. We really know little about how these emotions influence voters. I don't know if you guys can remember, probably you do, but let's take, for example, the Daisy ad, run during the 1964 presidential election by Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, this ad included a young girl picking petals off of a flower, which was subsequently followed by a countdown, and it ended in a nuclear explosion. Now, this ad was run during the height, or some people call the height of the Cold War. It's hard to deny that such an ad didn't invoke strong emotions among voters, especially fear. So how do these ads affect voters, and how does it affect their opinions and behaviors? Well, more recent research is starting to look at this. But I figured I'll start off with the more positive side of politics, what people would call feel-good ads, or ads that make us feel enthusiastic. So what does the research show about this? Well, the research on enthusiasm actually shows that it can increase people's reliance on their habitual routines. So say you're feeling enthusiastic, and that basically tells you that everything is running according to plan. So as a result, you're more likely to rely on your habits or your partisanship when making your decisions. So take, for example, Obama, right? And there's information that Obama is doing well in the economy, and you're a Democrat. So things are going well. You're feeling happy, you're feeling enthusiastic. I'm a Democrat, so I'm going to go out there and vote for Obama. There's also research showing that enthusiasm increases people's willingness to take part in politics. And the reason is that enthusiasm is an approach emotion. It tells us that our goals are being met and it's safe for action. So you're more likely, when you feel enthusiastic, to donate money to a campaign, as Professor Hertzen was talking about, or attend a rally, or make a phone call for your representative, like Cardozo. So now we're going to actually get into the more interactive part of the talk. So as Phil was discussing, we want you guys to go to umdreactlabs.org, and I assume that you guys have already agreed to the conditions, and I don't know what those conditions might be. And basically, the first ad, we're going to be showing you two ads, and the first ad is going to be an ad sponsored by Barack Obama. And here we just want to know, how does the ad make you feel? And you can respond hopeful, enthusiastic, afraid, or angry, and you can respond as many times as you want. So we're going to show the ad now.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
Tax havens, offshore accounts, carried interest. Mitt Romney has used every trick in the book. Romney admits that over the last 2 years, he's paid less than 15% in taxes on $43 million in income. Makes you wonder if some years he paid any taxes at all. We don't know because Romney has released just one full year of his tax returns and won't release anything before 2010.
You know what? I've put out as much as we're going to put out.
What is Mitt Romney hiding?
Now, it'll be interesting to see how you guys responded. I'm going to wait till the end of the talk to present you the data. But some might argue that this ad, or the purpose of this ad, was to invoke fear towards Romney. Basically, it was to make us feel highly uncertain about who Romney is. And research has shown that uncertainty is more likely to lead people to feel anxious or afraid. So what does the research tell us about fear ads? So what the research on fear tells us that it's unlike enthusiasm. Fear causes people to break out of habitual routines and more likely to search out for information on how to best respond to the threat. And this type of information that people are more likely to search, they search out for balanced information because maybe their candidate isn't the best choice. And because they're more likely to search out for balanced information, they're more likely to be open towards persuasion, right? They're more likely to support the other candidate. So as a result, that's why we constantly see candidates trying to invoke fear and anxiety among voters to make them feel anxious. This is one of the few times that we actually can see campaign ads, leads to persuasion, that leads people to actually not vote their partisanship and more likely to support the other candidate. So to give you both sides, not to just show you an Obama ad, I wanted to show you guys a Romney ad as well. So you guys are going to take out your smartphone again. We're good? Okay. And here we're going to watch an Obama ad, and you have the same emotional responses you can give, and that could be angry, afraid, enthusiastic, or hopeful. So is everyone ready? Am I moving too fast for you guys? No? Okay. So you can show the Obama ad.
In 1996, President Clinton and a bipartisan Congress helped end welfare as we know it by requiring work for welfare. But on July 12th, President Obama quietly announced a plan to gut welfare reform by dropping work requirements. Under Obama's plan, you wouldn't have to work and wouldn't have to train for a job. They just send you your welfare check. And welfare to work goes back to being plain old welfare. Mitt Romney will restore the work requirement because it works.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
Now, again, at the end of the talk, I will talk about how you guys reacted. But some might argue that the purpose of this ad, though the real purpose of this ad was to make people feel angry towards Obama. Because research has shown that when you bring ideas of unfairness and blame to mind, that's more likely to lead people to feel angry. But unlike fear and enthusiasm, there's hardly any work that's focused on the effect of ads that evoke anger. But there are a few studies on the effects of anger, and what they've shown is that anger actually increases people's willingness to participate. And the reason is that under states of anger, we have a strong sense of control, or what people will call efficacy. And because of that, we feel like we can alleviate the threat, so we take action. So that's why people will say is that when we think about the Tea Party movement and how angry they felt, that's why they were out, attending rallies, because they were angry. Anger is an emotion that makes you want to act. But there's also been research that shows that anger ads, anger ads where there's especially subtle or racially coded language, words like welfare and crime, these type of ads also can bring ideas about race to mind. So these anger ads, what research has shown is that it makes racial considerations a stronger predictor of people's vote choice. And what that means is that these ads make race a stronger criteria in how people evaluate their candidate or your candidate. If you guys can remember, the quintessential example of this, or some people might argue the quintessential example of this, was during the 1988 presidential election between George Bush Sr. and Michael Dukakis, where, if you guys can remember the quote-unquote Willie Horton ad, some people argue that it was the anger from this ad that made race more salient in people's decisions whether to support Bush. So in all, what is my comments or suggestions about the emotions from campaign ads? Or what's the takeaway? So candidates, they want to make their supporters feel enthusiastic, right? That gets them out to vote. That gets them to support their candidate. They also want to make their supporters angry about the other guy because that makes them, that actually motivates them to participate. But lastly, and more importantly, they want the supporters of their opponents to feel anxious because that leads them more likely to be persuaded. So now that I gave you guys a brief overview, and there's a lot of work on this, so that was a brief overview on the work of emotions in campaign ads, I think we're going to put up how you guys responded. Can I see? Oh, I can see this here. So I believe this is the first ad. This is the Obama sponsored ad. And I suspected that more people were going to respond with fear, but obviously I was wrong. This is the life of being a professor or researcher. You're not always right. It seemed that most people responded with anger towards the ad. Now, it'd be nice if, and eventually I know Phil is developing this technology where we can break up Republicans and Democrats and the income brackets and see whether that leads to different emotional responses. But it seems that from the audience, most people reacted with anger towards the Obama ad, the ad that attacked Romney and not disclosing his tax information. So can we skip to the next ad? Is this the next ad? This is, okay. So I was correct here. So the ad attacking Obama, the Romney ad, actually made people feel angry. So I'm 50% right, which is not bad. But as you can see, and I'm glad that you can see that these ads can invoke strong emotions, right? And these ads, depending on the emotions they can evoke, can have an important impact on how voters decide and whether they should go out and participate. Now, this is just a new area of research, so there's going to be a lot of more studies and findings to look at specifically more emotions like disgust and sadness or pride and the effects that it might have on voters. Well, I thank you for your time, and any questions you have on emotions in campaign ads, just let me know. All right, thank you.
I wish I could have tested my political ads on this technology. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Resnick, for sharing with us that remarkable voting technology, and to Professor Banks and both of our speakers for their fascinating presentations. And now we want to hear from all of you. We will have a brief question and answer session with our panelists. To ask the questions, please raise your hand, and a staff member will come to you and hand you a microphone. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but please bear in mind that we do have a limited amount of time for the questions. And I think we're going to have our experts come up on stage, and we'll ask the questions individually.
Is not on. Those lights are tough.
Okay, we've got the microphones in the back. Who's got our first question for the evening? Right here in the front. Sir, right here. You, yep.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Thomas. I'm a professor here in the School of Public Health. And when I come to events like this, I actually feel like I learned something. But when I'm standing in the line at Walmart and hear the kind of discussions, some of which you talked about the topics, I feel stupid. It's like I have too much information to engage in the people that I'm standing with who have very simple, very quick answers to the complexity that we learned about today. I've heard people that have Medicare claim that they want the government to get their hands off their health care. You understand what I'm saying? So here's my question to you. I don't know if I pull out my smartphone and they pull out their smartphone, but how can you have an audience like this, who now has good information, really engage in the public discourse that's occurring outside of this space, that's very loud and very passionate, that sometimes make people like us shut down and not engage in the discussion?
You want to go first, or should I go first? You want to go?
No, you go ahead.
I'll just comment that a lot of what we see in the media can make us angry or inspired and can affect elections. But the most important thing to remember is that the most influential thing that can persuade someone to vote or how to vote is a person. There is nothing more effective in campaigning than someone sticking out their hand and saying, "Hello, my name is Paul Herndson, and I know I look pretty ugly. It's a hot day in August in Prince George's County, but I'm here because I believe strongly in the candidacy of Glenn Ivey. And I can give you lots of reasons why, but I'm just here to tell you that he's a good person, he's a great candidate, he'll be terrific for our county, and I hope you can support him on Election Day." There is nothing more effective than that one-on-one conversation, especially when that conversation occurs between people who know each other.
Next question? Or does anyone else want to answer?
Do you want to go ahead?
I was just going to quickly second that. I think it's really hard to tune out the noise these days. There's not a whole lot of news that you get on the news anymore. It's a lot of talking heads, trying to defend their side and not answering real political questions that are important about the issues. So, I would second what Paul says. I mean, it's hard to get the personal, contact, but any way that you can do it. It's hard also to make people understand that the local elections, that what matter to us and what's going to influence our lives, those are the most important elections, actually. I mean, voting for president is really not the most important elections for us. It's our school board members, it's our state senators, it's our state legislators, it's the issues that are on the referendum. And going out and voting for those elections and those issues are what's really going to make a difference in our lives. And so trying to get familiar with those elections and those issues, it's probably a little bit easier to sort of tune out that noise than it is to try and tune out the noise in the national elections of what's going on. So trying to maybe do that instead of trying to, figure out how to get your hands off of, my Social Security or how Obamacare affects me or whatever, because you're not going to get an easy, straight answer to that, especially if you watch the news, because there is no news really to be had, quite honestly, to that. But trying to focus maybe on the more local issues that are going to affect you on a day-to-day life. And a lot of people, frankly, don't do that. And trying to turn that back around a little bit as we as citizens, that would be a good place to start.
I think if I understood your question correctly, I think you were asking about deliberation, about why both sides aren't talking to each other. And if that was your question, if I'm understanding it correctly, in terms of my work, a lot of people have shown that anger makes people kind of steadfast in their opinions. They're not willing to compromise. So all this angry rhetoric that we see out here from both sides might kind of contribute, might be a part explanation about why we don't see both sides coming together. I don't know if that helps you.
I could just add one thing. The welfare ad that we saw that was posted up, I was in the state legislature and I was the deciding vote in the state legislature to enact welfare reform in 1996 in California. And the waivers that they're talking about that President Obama signed are requested by local governors for different reasons to allow them to have some flexibility in the law. It doesn't throw out the whole Welfare Reform Act. It just allows local government to have some flexibility at their request for a particular reason. And so the law, or the commercial, is technically right, but misinterprets what President Obama did by that signature. And so you always have to be careful when you look at these things to differentiate what is the difference between the wheat and the chaff, and what is fact, and why the president acted and how he did. Sometimes it could have been ideologically driven, and he could have done something that was really onerous and wrong. In this particular case, I think he was trying to do what some actual Republican governors in some cases asked him to do. So it wasn't quite what you might expect. Next question.
My name is Stephanie Groff. My question deals with the second presentation. How predict that they're actually going to be able to test the voter restrictions? Just because right now it seems like it's a lot of either people trying to prevent the fraud or people, warning the fact that they might be restricted. But would they compare it to the 2008 election, like say less people? I don't know if you could go off on that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They are going to compare voter turnout to the previous election. That's going to be one way to do it. Now, quite honestly, a lot of the states that passed these voter ID laws, the laws have been overturned. There's been injunctions put into place. So, those efforts have been stalled out in a lot of the states, as I showed just on the example of the 3 states. But many of the other states, those efforts have been sort of swelled to a certain degree. And also, we'll also see with, even in the states where the laws have been upheld or there hasn't been, the challenge hasn't gone through the court system, we'll also see how in the states where they can vote provisionally, how that provisional system is handled, right? So if there's a lot of problems during election day and how the provisional system is handled, whether there's a lot of problems with that, how it's communicated, how the new laws are communicated to poll workers, so how the information flows down to the poll workers on election day. So all those things are going to be examined very closely. But to answer your question, you sort of answered it yourself, actually, right? Turnout's going to be compared to the 2008 election, when a lot of those laws were not yet implemented because they were implemented post in 2010, when a lot of that effort was done post 2010 midterm elections.
You ready for the next question over here?
I have a question about your target audience out here tonight. Actually, I'd like to understand how many people sitting here actually have a smartphone and were able to vote. Okay. You'd have to be able to check. So about half the audience?
More.
More than that?
75%.
75%, okay. So just trying to be sure we were all able to get logged in. I sat here with an iPad and an iPhone next to us, and we were unable to even get in and vote. So while we might have all had it, I'm not sure we got it reflected in the voting, first of all. Second, I have a question for you. That ad that you were talking about, which was the Daisy ad, ran one time and one time only. And just curious as to your analysis of ads that are going on in the marketplace. Are you doing things other than electronic analysis of whether those ads are effective or not? And a little bit about what you've already seen through the primaries.
Basically, I don't look at the frequency of the ads or the types of ads. I look at just more of the emotions that evoked from the ads. Most of my work looks at emotions in general, and one medium or one way to look at that is through campaign ads. There's a lot of work that looks at, most of the work is looked at enthusiasm and fear, and how fear from ads affects whether people are willing to be persuaded, because a lot of the research on campaign ads hasn't been able to find strong persuasion effects. That even though you show someone an ad, it's not likely to persuade them to leave their partisanship and support the other candidate. So people have been looking at specific emotions to see whether that might be one way or one avenue that we can see persuasion effects.
Who's got the mic going?
I have a related question.
Okay.
Assuming the majority of the electorate are not really influenced by the ads, they're pretty much predetermined as to who they're going to vote for.
Yep.
There's a relatively small percentage that are undecided, and perhaps even a smaller percentage that may actually be influenced by the ads and change their position, whether those ads are negative or positive. How does one measure the effectiveness of the ads on these people?
Well, what you could do is look at people's partisanship. So kind of getting at your point, if you would suspect that most people already have their strong convictions about who they're going to support. So people who are really strongly to be Democrat or really strong Republicans, the ads might not affect them. But those people in the middle, those leaning people who Obama and Romney might be fighting for, that's where you might see your biggest effect. And research has kind of suggested that.
But how do you see or measure those effects?
Well, I mean, you can run an experiment and I can give you a talk where you can run experiments and show people ads and do statistical analysis to see whether the effect is bigger among certain groups. So that's how people test to see whether those ads have an effect.
Anybody else want to comment? I can tell you from my own polling that 28% of the Democrats would vote for me no matter how I voted in Congress, because I was a Democrat, and 32% of my constituents would vote for the Republican opponent of mine, no matter if I was the best guy that ever set foot in Congress. And I knew that those were the numbers that I started out with every election.
I can comment on that. There's also a line of research that takes a look at people's voting decisions through polls and then overlays on that polling data the tone of the ads and the amount of money spent on them, and finds some impact, particularly on mobilization of voters.
Who's at the microphone over here?
Yeah, I had a question. Actually, that might concern you. I want to know, will we be seeing innovations in technology replacing conventional or traditional voting systems so that those without ID or who are otherwise unable to vote traditionally can vote, maybe from the comfort and privacy of their own homes? Or are those systems more susceptible to voter fraud and hacking?
I can address that. Here at the University of Maryland, we worked with the Maryland State Board of Elections to develop what we call the electronic absentee ballot delivery service. And the way it works is you ask for it either in person, over the phone, by mail, or by contacting your state or county election officials through the web. And what the system does is when the actual ballot hard copy is ready, the PDF that would be printed on and sent out to a traditional absentee voter, when that is ready, the ballot and the oath that accompanies it and the envelope to return it in, when it's all ready, people who've signed up for this electronically delivered ballot are notified. They can click onto a website, they can use a specific tracking number, and they can receive their ballot printed out along with all the other materials that would accompany a paper absentee ballot, including the affidavit that accompanies it, that you are who you are and you're voting legally, and you can also print out the address on an envelope and vote just like any other absentee voter. The advantages of it are that this kind of ballot is particularly helpful to people abroad, including our men and women in the armed services who are out in the field, because rather than waiting on a mail ballot to reach them, which is the major problem that prevents them from voting, they get it instantaneously and they only have to worry about it getting back through the mail. It also works to the advantage of young people who are mobile because they can get a ballot no matter where they are just by registering it for it that way. Other advantages are for the elderly or disabled or people with limited mobility. So instead of being in a nursing home and all of the absentee ballots arrive by mail at one time and some staffer there helps you fill them out, you do it privately. So the system not only has convenience, but it has measures to prevent coercion. One of the other advantages of it is that if some coercion does occur, maybe someone goes down to the basement and forces Granny to vote a certain way, or Sergeant Bilko makes Gomer Pyle, some of you may remember that show, to vote a certain way, you can report it and get another ballot. So it has several advantages over a standard mail paper ballot. Ultimately, though, the integrity of everything in voting relies on people who sign affidavits as to who they are being truthful and honest. And so there is no difference other than how it's delivered between this ballot and another ballot.
I'd like to follow up on that and say really quickly that it's pretty interesting that the upswell in passing strict voter ID laws, there is no real targeting on absentee voter or mail voting. It's only an in-person voter ID, right? So if one were to think kind of rationally about where maybe the concentration of voter ID might happen and where the possibility of, or the prevalence for voter ID might occur, it might actually be in absentee voting, right? Paul just told you that it relies on somebody signing an oath to say they are who they say they are. And the folks pushing for strict voter ID laws are not going after absentee ballots. They're not going after mail ballots. They're going after in-person voter ID. So I'm just stating that as a fact. I'm not, I'll leave you to draw your conclusions about that, but I find that kind of interesting that that's where the effort is being placed is on the in-person voter ID with all these laws that are being passed. It seems to me that there would be more prevalence for voter fraud in these other forms of voting where it relies on somebody signing an oath to say who they are, rather than somebody having to verify with some form of identification, perhaps not necessarily a government-issued form of identification, but some form of identification in a lot of states, that would be sort of a deterrence for voter fraud as opposed to you having to sign an oath. Just saying.
We have time for one more question. I think it's going to be over here. Well, you don't have it, Mike, out. Who's got? It's over here. I would just like to make one point. From my experience, I used to be on the committee in the California legislature that wrote the state laws for elections law. And one of the testimonies that we got at that time is the highest abuse for voter fraud was those people who get paid $4 per ballot to register voters. They would register people because they have an incentive that never existed. And that was the most people that got convicted under voter fraud laws in our area, in our state. Last question over here.
My question is regarding the first presentation. I think we identified that a lot of people disagree with the way campaign finance currently works. If a change were to be made, what do you think a likely way for this would be? Do you think Citizens United decision would have to be overturned, or are there other means?
So court decisions are a lot easier to make than passing legislation. I pointed out that many people, including candidates and also members of Congress, are very unhappy with our campaign finance system. That doesn't mean they agree about the things they're unhappy about. I'll give you a few examples. And because of the differences of opinion, this poses major obstacle to reform. Every member of Congress, every politician who's been elected usually loves the system that elected them because A, it elected them, and B, they know how to work it. And perhaps C, they know it advantages them over other candidates. So let's talk about the current system, even as it exists today, which is greatly unraveled. How do you pass reform in a system where you've got Democrats and Republicans pretty evenly divided? It's difficult because they have different constituencies that vote for them. They have different constituencies that finance their campaigns. So we have partisan differences. Republicans tend to want to let money flow and not require people to disclose it. Democrats want disclosure, and many want public funding or some sort of free TV, which is common in other democracies. That's one division. Now let's look at the House. House incumbents receive usually 45 to 50% of their money through traditional political action committees. The percentage for Senate is 13%. So they rely on different sources. Senators, individual contributions, House members, political action committees are more important. When we look beyond that, incumbents have tremendous advantages in fundraising over challengers. Women and minorities tend to raise money from different constituencies, more national constituencies than comparable groups of men. People from wealthy districts would love to see a reform passed that says all of your fundraising has to be done within your district. Why? Because that district elects them, because the financiers of elections in that district know them and tend to support them. So that would be a major Incumbent Protection Act. Members of Congress and other politicians from less affluent districts often need to raise money nationwide. When you're fundraising, you go where the money is. And so they would have a different perspective. So passing reform is very difficult. It usually requires people to be driving for it for years, a moderate proposal, politicians to have pledged to do something and then find themselves caught in the position of voting for it or being hypocrites, and the support of the media, and most important, a triggering event. Some major scandal that just makes voters furious and really puts pressure on people in office to do something. So court rulings, regulatory decisions by the FEC, you'll get more changes there than you will legislatively. That's the situation, unfortunately.
That was a great answer, and can we give a big round of applause to our panelists? Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great evening. I want to thank you all for coming and participating with both your phones and your questions. And thanks to our many faculty presenters for sharing so much information, as well as to BSOS and the Colonnade Society for hosting tonight's event. Good night, and don't forget to vote.